So I'm going to tack on a little bit to the last video since I had to rush a little bit at the end. And I want to talk about the role of sports in the progressive movement because it's interesting. As I was saying in the previous video, that baseball was a progressive game, and it was a game that many immigrants played, and it was the way that they kind of learned about what American society was all about. And it was interesting because the umpire was usually an Anglo-Saxon man, and so immigrants had to learn to accept the balls and strike calls from this Anglo-Saxon man without complaining about it. It's obviously also a highly regimented game, even though it's being played on a big field. It gets played on a diamond, and you have to stay within the lines, and you have to run the bases, and everything is very well ordered and patterned. So if you were to go into those stands and see who those people were, they would have been immigrants themselves. So lots and lots of immigrants, factory workers, people who lived in urban settings. And the reason progressives loved baseball, it was a way to get people out to the park. And frequently, while people were drinking before they went into the park, at least progressives would encourage people not to drink in the baseball area. So it was a dry area, meaning there wasn't alcohol there. So progressives thought it would be good because it was a way to Americanize immigrants and to get them to behave better. When it comes to, again, football and the cult of masculinity, this is interesting because if you look at the football, the best teams in football in the first part of the 20th century, they were all Ivy League teams. In other words, football was a sport for the upper class and the upper middle class, and it was a way to toughen them up. If you're going to be arguing that the Anglo-Saxon is the strongest race, which they were doing in straight up racist way, you have to be able to show your toughness. So this was upper class people proving their toughness and their masculinity. So this is how you make people destined to work in offices tougher and more manly, but also able to deliver violence in an organized way. So again, another progressive game. When it comes to the national parks, which I mentioned a little bit before, this is extremely important also because this is the idea of let's just get us back to this Jeffersonian world. Let's move back to an earlier time when people were more self-sufficient, get them out of the city. The city is a bad environment and the countryside is a good one. There's clearer air. It allows for character development. You can go hiking. You're going to do things that will be good for you. And so this idea of bringing in national parks, and again, millions of acres of it under the progressive President Teddy Roosevelt, who you see on the left, this was part of a larger way of trying to get people to reform themselves. Education, as I said before, wasn't just about learning in school. It was about learning to salute the flag, learning how to pledge allegiance, learning how to be an American. This is a very important part of the progressive movement. And as you can see, the old Pledge of Allegiance was done not by putting your hand on your heart, but by giving a salute with your palm forward and down. Obviously, Adolf Hitler changed all that. But if you look at this, again, English classes, classes in American history, all of these things were part of the progressive movement. So let's put this all together, and here's where I want to summarize. The progressive goals and approaches basically revolved around the idea that we want moral improvement. We want people to be better. And this is particularly true of men, right, who tended to be a little unruly, drank too much, fought, more prone to crime. Also trying to improve immigrants. So this was a way that Anglo-Saxon women and men could make immigrants behave more like mainstream Americans. They used scientific principles. They used ways of ordering things to try and get to better forms of life. And they also were interested in regulation of business. So we're moving away from laissez-faire. We're moving away from just broad competition to making sure that factories aren't hiring children, that they're giving people enough time off for them to work, to be with their families. So this is going to be um, allowing for reforms like the weekend, for example, that you get days off so that you can not just be working in the factory the whole time. So you're reforming urban areas in the way that we mentioned, in all the ways that progressives cleaned up the city. You're Americanizing the immigrants. You're emphasizing the education. You're going to reduce class differences, so you're going to do that through tax policy, and you're going to do that through education too. Another big part of this is temperance, which is getting rid of alcohol. So obviously the 18th Amendment, which is going to make alcohol consumption illegal, is a big part of this. And this is kind of obvious. Alcohol tends to lead to bad behavior by men, everything from assault and sexual assault and not going to work and beating the kids and these sorts of things. So if you stop that, you're going to get to better behavior. And obviously increasing democracy. That starts with giving the women the vote, but also having more people voting. More people voting means more democratic control of the system. So the specific approaches, we're going to have mandatory schooling laws. You have to go to school until age 16. Factories cannot employ children to work. They have to go to school instead. So this keeps people who are your age doing what they should be doing, which is going to school and not just working all the time. Antitrust laws were basically ways of breaking up monopolies. So you're creating more opportunities for people to have economic opportunity. The Food and Drug Administration was making sure that the food and the things that you put into your body were safe. So this also involves factory inspections. There were building codes, as we mentioned before, and zoning laws, the playgrounds to basically impact children's behavior, the settlement houses, which we mentioned, in the urban parks. So finally, we have a bunch of amendments, each one of them designed to fix a particular problem. So the income tax obviously is put in place, progressive income tax, meaning that people who are richer paid more tax and people who are poor paid lesser tax. And that meant that the differences in income and the differences in social classes would be reduced, right? So this is not just laissez-faire, let people make the money they're going to make. It's redistributing that money through urban reform programs. So the income tax was a big progressive amendment. The 17th Amendment, senators used to be elected by state legislatures. Now they're going to be directly elected by the people. And this took the power of the state legislatures in the first part of the 20th century, were increasingly dominated by immigrants. And so this is taking senators and putting their election back into the hands of the people, more broadly speaking. There's the democracy as the solution. We mentioned before the 18th Amendment, the prohibition of alcohol, one of the worst laws ever passed because it immediately led to increased amounts of drinking and large amounts of drinking by the very people that they didn't want drinking. So again, the idea was to change behavior. It didn't work out so well. And the final one, maybe most important in the long term, was giving women the vote. And obviously that came as a result of women who were involved in the whole progressive movement. So in some ways, the suffrage, the giving of the vote, was the culmination of all of the things that women had been doing in all of these other areas, in the settlement houses, in the reform movements, in doing all of this work in the cities. They were getting very involved in politics, and that ultimately helped them get the vote. So if you look at the goals of the progressives, they're outlined here, and hopefully that gives you a better sense of the movement overall.